Did you know it's estimated that more than 12,000 people die from an asbestos-related disease each year in the United States? Well, depending on where you work or live, you may be at risk for asbestos exposure. When asbestos fibers are left undisturbed, they are not a health hazard. But once disturbed or damaged, the fibers get released into the air and can become embedded in the lungs if inhaled. Over time, the fibers damage the lungs and can cause several different diseases where symptoms often take a decade or more to appear after exposure. Asbestos exposure is more common in some industries, such as construction, compared to other industries. Let's consider a less obvious field where exposure may occur: education. Now consider this scenario. Mr. Smith was an elementary school teacher from 1973 through 2005. In 1976, a remodel was being completed in Mr. Smith's school where only plastic sheeting was used to separate the teachers and students from the asbestos-containing materials that were being removed from the building. In 2013, 37 years later, Mr. Smith was diagnosed with mesothelioma, which is a cancer connected to asbestos exposure. Now, at that time, it was thought that the barriers used in the school were enough to protect people from asbestos. Today, we know that more control and preventive methods are needed to keep everyone safe. Being aware of how asbestos affects the body and where it's found, as well as having methods in place for workers' protection, are all essential for the safety of everyone in the workplace. In this course, we'll be discussing what asbestos is and why it's a health hazard, where it's found, and who's most at risk, the rules and regulations in place to help protect workers, and various other methods used to prevent and monitor exposure. Many of us have heard of asbestos at one point in our lives, but we may not know what it actually is. It might have been from our parents discussing insulation in their childhood homes, or from a TV commercial for a lawsuit. Well, maybe it's a term you've never really heard much about, so let's learn more about it together. Now, according to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, asbestos is the name given to a group of naturally occurring tiny fibrous minerals that are resistant to heat and corrosion. Asbestos fibers are extremely useful due to their durability, flexibility, and tensile strength. When released into the air, they have no odor or taste. They aren't irritating to the eyes, nose, or throat. All asbestos fibers are silicate compounds, which means they contain silicon and oxygen as well as other elements. Now, there are several different types of fibers, including chrysotile, crocidolite, amosite, and tremolite. Chrysotile accounts for about 95% of the commercially used asbestos in the United States. When asbestos is disturbed or damaged, the tiny fibers become airborne and can easily be inhaled or ingested. Most of the fibers will be caught by the protective mucous lining in the lungs and ejected from the body through coughing. Any remaining fibers become embedded in the tissues of the respiratory or digestive system. Once in the lungs, the fibers travel to the lower regions and can cause severe damage and disease, including certain cancers. And the fibers may be in the lungs for decades after exposure before symptoms appear. If you have ever been exposed to asbestos and have shortness of breath, trouble swallowing, a persistent chronic cough, blood in your mucus, or tightening in your chest, you may be experiencing symptoms of an asbestos-related disease. Now, there are 4 major diseases that can be caused by breathing asbestos. Asbestosis is a serious, progressive, long-term disease that scars the lungs, making it harder for oxygen and carbon dioxide to pass through. Pleural disease is a lung condition that causes the membrane surrounding the lungs and chest cavity to thicken or fill with fluid, making the lungs less efficient. Lung cancer is when a tumor can grow and block or invade air passageways. Asbestos exposure has also been linked to cancers of the ovary and larynx. Mesothelioma is an aggressive and rare form of cancer that attacks the lining around the lungs, chest, and abdomen. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention cites many factors that can play a role in the risk of disease after exposure. Now, these factors include the length of time, the amount present in the air, and how often exposure occurs. The source, size, shape, and composition of the fibers also play a major role. Amphibole is known to be more harmful than chrysotile, as studies have shown that it can be harder for the lungs to extract. Now, if you're a person with another breathing condition, a tobacco smoker, or you have a genetic mutation to the BAP1 gene, you are at even more risk of disease. Now that you know what asbestos is and the harm it can cause to the body, it's important to discuss the major sources of asbestos. Asbestos is found naturally within the Earth's crust in certain types of rock formations. Asbestos can be released into the soil, air, or water when these rocks are crushed or broken to be directly extracted from mines. Asbestos has been used in many industries, including construction, manufacturing, automotive, and the maritime industry. Now that more is known about the health hazards possible from asbestos, there are regulations in place which have reduced its use when possible. We'll discuss these in more detail later. For now, let's discuss where in each of these industries asbestos has been used. Today, asbestos is not used as much in the construction industry as it was through the 1980s. In older buildings in particular, asbestos can be found in construction materials, including insulation, ceiling tiles, cement products, floor tiles and adhesives, paint, and as a coating on hot water pipes. Anytime a product with asbestos is disturbed or damaged, the fibers are released into the air. For example, after 9/11, many rescue, recovery, and cleanup workers were exposed to released asbestos when the North Tower was damaged. Similar to the construction industry, due to the chemical properties of asbestos, it's also been used in ship construction. Now, on ships, it might be found in the deck and pipe insulation, wall and ceiling panels, HVAC ducts, cement floor tiles, and adhesives. Similar to the construction industry, there are now regulations in place to limit its use, but if a ship is damaged and requires repairs, you may be exposed. All asbestos-containing materials, ACMs, have to be manufactured. If you've ever worked for a manufacturing company that designs insulation, coating for pipes, flooring, friction products, heat-resistant fabrics, paper products, and other building materials, you may have been asked to create products that include asbestos. OSHA and the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA regulations, have since banned the continued use of asbestos in some of these products. Given the unreasonably detrimental risk posed by exposure to chrysotile asbestos, legislation regarding its use continues to grow more restrictive. Due to its durability and resistance to corrosion and heat, asbestos was regularly used in automotive brakes and clutches until 1999. Now, although rarely used in newer cars, if you work in the automotive repair industry, you could be exposed to asbestos during a brake or clutch repair on an older vehicle. All of us are exposed to low levels of asbestos at some point in our lives, since it's found naturally in the air, water, and soil. There are also occupational risks within various industries. Now, extracting asbestos from mines ceased in the United States in 2002, but prior to this, mining workers were some of the most at risk to asbestos exposure and its effects. In addition, those who worked in the paper and steel milling industry were also at very high risk. In the 1960s and 70s, asbestos was used in the majority of construction building materials, and workers in construction and related industries were at great risk to exposure. Today, most asbestos exposure occurs when asbestos-containing materials, ACMs, installed in the past are disturbed. This includes the repair, renovation, demolition, removal, and maintenance of ACMs. As we just discussed, occupations where risk is highest include auto repair and manufacturing, construction, painters, pipe fitters, insulators, refinery workers, shipyard workers, welders, roofers, as well as many others. Construction jobs are separated into 4 classes when it comes to asbestos. Class 1, the most potentially hazardous, involves jobs that require the removal of asbestos-containing thermal system insulation. Class 2 includes the removal of all other ACMs, including flooring and roofing materials. Class 3 includes all jobs that repair or maintain ACMs. And finally, Class 4, the least hazardous class, involves custodial work connected to the cleanup of contaminated surfaces or materials. Asbestos exposure is not limited to general industry. You could be exposed in your own home. If you live in an older home and you're completing home renovations, which involve the maintenance or removal of insulation, flooring, roofing, or piping, you too may be at risk of exposure. The only way to know if a material in your home contains asbestos and at what level is to have it tested by a qualified laboratory. The EPA recommends having suspected ACMs tested if these materials are damaged or going to be disturbed during removal or renovation. Depending on where the asbestos is and the risk of disturbing it, this will involve either abatement or remediation. Abatement is the process of removing or reducing the severity of something so it's no longer a threat or hazard. A remediation is the more comprehensive approach. It involves abatement but also addresses the underlying problem at its core, so it cannot be a threat or hazard again. It's important to be aware of possible exposure and to follow proper OSHA and EPA protective protocols. Let's dive into the rules and regulations put in place to protect everyone from asbestos exposure. OSHA began regulating asbestos in 1971, where an 8-hour total weighted average permissible exposure limit, known as an 8-hour TWA-PEL, of 12 fibers per cubic centimeter, or cc, of air was put in place. Within a year, this standard was changed to 5 fibers per cc of air. Now, as more information became available, OSHA continued to update its regulations. Today, the 8-hour permissible exposure limit is 0.1 fibers per cc of air, nearly 1/100th of the original PEL. This means that over the course of a 40-hour work week, an employee's average airborne exposure during an 8-hour shift should be at a concentration of 0.1 fibers per cc of air or less. Now, in addition, employees must not be exposed to a short-term exposure limit of a concentration greater than 1 fibers per cc of air over any 30-minute period. Employers are required to perform exposure monitoring daily for all Class 1 and Class 2 jobs by taking 1 or more air samples at various times throughout the workday in all work areas with potential asbestos exposure. In work areas with tasks where higher concentrations are expected, 30-minute short-term exposure samples must also be collected. Daily monitoring is not required when all employees are using positive pressure respirators and when a negative exposure assessment has been completed for the entire work area and no changes have been detected. For all other tasks, employers must monitor all areas where the exposure might exceed the PEL of 0.1 fibers per cc often enough to require monitoring. In addition to the required exposure monitoring, OSHA also provides standards that employers must follow in all regulated areas. Now, OSHA defines a regulated area as a marked-off site where employees are actively working with asbestos, where asbestos debris or waste may accumulate, or where the concentration of asbestos in the air could exceed the PEL of 0.1 fibers per cc of air. Regulated areas can only be entered by those with permission, cannot exceed a set number of people at any given time, and must be designed to protect others working nearby but outside of the area. To protect those nearby, barriers, plastic sheeting, or negative pressure enclosures must be present at all openings. Anyone entering a regulated area must wear a respirator, and while inside, eating, drinking, and smoking are not permitted. Warning signs must be posted in all regulated areas. These signs must state that there is a danger of asbestos, which can cause cancer and damage to the lungs. In addition to the required warning signs within regulated areas, all ACM products and waste and storage containers with asbestos must also have a warning label attached. Now, all labels are required to follow OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard and must be printed in large, bold letters with a contrasting background. The warning labels must state that it contains asbestos, is a cancer and lung disease hazard, and to not create dust when handling. Exceptions to this rule include when concentrations are less than 1% by weight and when the fibers have been altered or bound and cannot be released into the air when handled over the PEL or STEL. Now, OSHA isn't the only one with regulations when working with asbestos. The EPA has also established several standards for minimizing the release of asbestos into the air. Now, under the Clean Air Act, asbestos was first categorized as an air toxic in 1971. This led to the establishment of the Asbestos National Emissions Standard for hazardous air pollutants and related standards. Under the NES-HAP, specific work practices and protocols must be followed during the demolition and renovation of all structures. First, a thorough investigation is required by the delegated state agency, and then, once approved to complete the job, these work practices must be followed to reduce asbestos emissions while removing, sealing, and disposing of any ACMs. During the demolition or renovation, work practices must be monitored at all times by at least one on-site highly trained individual. Now, there are also special requirements for waste containers and how landfills handle and secure the contaminated waste. In addition to the NES-HAP, there are several other related regulations, which include the Asbestos-Containing Materials in School Rule, which requires all schools and educational buildings to be inspected for asbestos, requires that a plan is in place for the management, reduction, and removal of asbestos hazards, and provide funding to the schools for this to be completed. The Asbestos Worker Protection Rule expands the worker protection requirements to all employees exposed to asbestos but not originally covered by OSHA's regulations. The Asbestos Ban and Phase-Out Rule of 1989, which originally banned the use of asbestos in all products and was later revised to only ban its use in flooring felt, rollboard, and various paper products, as well as using it for the first time in new products. The rules and regulations we've discussed are all in place to minimize asbestos exposure and to protect workers, but they aren't the only ones related to asbestos. Please seek additional training as needed to learn more. As we conclude our study on asbestos exposure, hazards, and prevention, let's review some of the key concepts we've discussed. We explored what asbestos is, where it's found, and who's most at risk. We discussed that asbestos is a health hazard and the symptoms and types of asbestos-related diseases. We summarized the essential rules, regulations, laws, and acts put in place by both OSHA and the EPA related to worker protection from asbestos exposure. We also reviewed the requirements with which employers must comply, including exposure monitoring, proper barriers and PPE in regulated areas, and the required warning signs and labels if asbestos is present. Knowing where asbestos might be found, how to recognize signs and symptoms caused by asbestos exposure, and the required methods of control and prevention to reduce or to eliminate this type of exposure at work helps to promote a safe environment for all. Now, awareness is key to keep you and your coworkers and those you care about safe from asbestos exposure and the harm it can cause. If you recognize an asbestos hazard on the job, inform your supervisor and follow proper protocol to ensure exposure is reduced or eliminated as soon as possible. As needed, seek out additional training to help stay up to date on all rules and regulations. If you are experiencing shortness of breath, chest tightness, fatigue, or any other asbestos-related disease symptoms, it is important to seek out medical advice.